Hello everyone, this is History PhD channel, where we explore fascinating historical mysteries together. Today, I'd like to lead you into one of the darkest chapters of American history, but also a story of hope, resilience, and an extraordinary president who changed the destiny of an entire nation. Imagine this. On October 24, 1929, the Wall Street stock market crashed in panic. Millions of Americans lost everything overnight. Unemployment soared to 25%. People lined up for rations. Once prosperous families were forced into makeshift slums known as Hooverville. This was the Great Depression, the most devastating economic disaster the modern world has ever witnessed. But amidst the ruins, a paralyzed man in a wheelchair rose up, not with his legs, but with an iron will and extraordinary vision. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, at age 50, vowed to bring about the New Deal for America. What did he do to pull 130 million Americans out of the abyss of despair? What bold decisions reshaped the face of America to this day? And can humanity overcome crisis with faith and action alone? Imagine a picture of America in 1928. On the streets of New York, Ford Model A cars rumbled by, jazz music blared from bootleg bars, and women in short skirts and high heels danced the Charleston. After World War I, America was not only the victorious superpower, but also the world's economic center. President Herbert Hoover, upon taking office on March 4, 1929, confidently declared, "We are nearing complete victory over poverty." He, a successful 54-year-old mining engineer, firmly believed in economic liberalism and the power of the free market. But behind that glamorous facade lay an economy teetering on the brink of collapse. What few realized was that the prosperity of the 1920s belonged to a privileged minority. While the wealthiest 1% controlled 40% of the nation's total wealth, over 60% of American families lived on less than $2,000 a year, the minimum wage considered essential for basic necessities. Farmers struggled with plummeting agricultural prices since 1920. Thousands of small rural banks went bankrupt silently, but nobody cared because the allure of Wall Street was too dazzling. And that's where the heart of the storm was forming, the New York Stock Exchange. From 1924 to 1929, the Dow Jones Index nearly five-fold. Everyone from wealthy businessmen to office workers, shoemakers, even servants flocked to the stock market. They believed in a dangerous myth. Stock prices would rise forever. Charles Mitchell, president of National City Bank, one of the largest banks in America at the time, encouraged clients to borrow money to buy stocks with a margin of just 10%. That meant you only needed $1,000 to buy $10,000 worth of stock. When prices rose, you got rich quickly. But when prices fell, the disaster would be tenfold. In September 1929, the Dow Jones Index reached its historic high of 381.17 points on September 3rd. But shrewd investors were beginning to sense ominous signs. Roger Babson, a 64-year-old financial analyst, warned in a speech on September 5th, "Sooner or later a crash will come, and it could be terrible." Immediately, the market fell 3% that day, an event known as the Babson Break. But most people scoffed at him. Professor Irving Fisher of Yale University, one of the most respected economists, declared on October 16, 1929, "Stock prices have reached a permanent high." That was perhaps the worst prediction in the history of economics. Just 8 days later, the gates of hell opened. Thursday, October 24, 1929, the day history calls Black Thursday. When the opening bell rang at 10 a.m. at the New York Stock Exchange, a violent sell-off began. Not a slow sell-off, but a flood. Trading volume reached 12.9 million shares, a record number that the paper tape system of the time couldn't keep up with. Stock prices plummeted. By 11 a.m., crowds had gathered outside 11 Wall Street, anxiously watching. Inside, brokers traded with pale faces, shouting and yelling, many collapsing from stress. At 12:30 p.m., 6 of America's most powerful bankers held an emergency meeting at the offices of J.P. Morgan and Company, the most powerful investment bank. Thomas Lamont, a senior partner at Morgan and a dapper 59-year-old gentleman, made the decision to intervene. They assembled a $240 million fund to buy stocks, hoping to avert panic. This strategy had proven effective during the 1907 crisis. At 1:30 p.m., Richard Whitney, vice president of the exchange, entered the trading floor confidently, placing an order to buy 10,000 shares of U.S. Steel at a price higher than the market rate. The signal was clear. The powerful were protecting the market. The market recovered, ending the day with only a slight decline. But that was only a temporary illusion. Over the weekend, fear spread. Investors received notices demanding additional margin calls. They had to sell assets or borrow money. By Monday, October 28th, Black Monday, the real flood arrived. 9.25 million shares were sold off in desperation. The Dow Jones Index fell 13% in a single day. And if that was the worst, Tuesday, October 29th, 1929, Black Tuesday, was the real financial apocalypse. 1,644 million shares were sold, a record unbroken for nearly 40 years. The numbers on the paper scrolls lagged behind reality by 2.5 hours. No one knew the true price. Chaos reigned. Those who had been rich that morning became bankrupt by evening. Some jumped from high-rise buildings, though the actual figures were fewer than the legends claimed. The despair was real. Winston Churchill, the British statesman who was in New York at the time, witnessed the chaos and later wrote, "I have seen a tragedy unprecedented in modern times." By the end of November 1929, the stock market had lost $30 billion, equivalent to the entire cost of the United States in World War I. But what was even more frightening was that this collapse was only the beginning. Most people, including President Hoover, believed this was just a temporary correction. On November 15th, Hoover summoned major industrialists like Henry Ford to the White House and demanded that they pledge not to cut wages or lay off workers. Ford, the notoriously stubborn 66-year-old, promised. But it was just empty promises. In reality, Ford began mass layoffs just months later. And that's why the next disaster was far more devastating. When the stock market crashed, the banks that had lent money to buy stocks suddenly realized that their loans were no longer backed by any assets. Borrowers couldn't repay their debts. Banks started demanding urgent repayment. Businesses couldn't borrow money to pay salaries. They laid off workers. Unemployed workers had no money to buy goods. Shops closed. The economy went into a death spiral. And the only person with the power to stop this vicious cycle, President Herbert Hoover, was completely trapped in his outdated philosophy. To understand why the Great Depression was so devastating, we must understand the man sitting in the Oval Office at the time, Herbert Clark Hoover. This is one of history's most tragic paradoxes. A talented, humane man, once a symbol of American success, became the villain in this tragedy. But did he truly deserve the contempt history bestows upon him? Herbert Hoover was born in Iowa in 1874 and became an orphan at the age of 9. Through talent and hard work, he graduated from Stanford University with a degree in mining engineering and became a millionaire before the age of 40, thanks to his mining business spanning the globe from Australia to China. During World War I, he organized humanitarian aid for Belgium, saving millions from starvation. Belgian author Émile Commerz called him the greatest man of his time. Upon returning to the United States, Hoover served under Presidents Harding and Coolidge as Secretary of Commerce and was considered a brilliant administrator. When Hoover was sworn in as president on March 4, 1929, at the age of 54, he embodied the American dream, rising from a poor orphan to the pinnacle of power. He deeply believed in rugged individualism, the belief that each individual must be self-reliant and that the government should not interfere in economic life. This philosophy had brought him personal success, and he believed it would work for the entire nation. But when the crisis struck, this philosophy became a shackles binding him. On November 15, 1929, just 3 weeks after Black Tuesday, Hoover held a series of meetings with business leaders, union leaders, and state governors. He urged them to maintain jobs and investment, but this was a voluntary request, not a mandatory one. He refused to intervene directly in the economy, believing that the free market would self-regulate. On December 5, 1929, in his State of the Union address, he optimistically declared, "The fundamental economic activity of the nation remains on solid and prosperous foundations." That was a huge mistake. The reality was quite the opposite. In 1930, 1,352 American banks went bankrupt, more than double the number in 1929. When a bank failed, all customer deposits disappeared. There was no Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, like there is today. Millions of people lost their life savings. Widespread fear led to bank runs. People rushed to banks to withdraw their money before it was too late, leaving even healthy banks without enough cash to pay out and causing them to go bankrupt. The U.S. gross domestic product, GDP, fell by 8.5% in 1930. Unemployment rose from 3.2% in 1929 to 8.7% in 1930, then to 15.9% in 1931. By 1932, it had reached 23.6%. Almost a quarter of the workforce was unemployed. Within those dry statistics lay millions of personal tragedies. Men who had once worked hard to support their families now lined up at soup kitchens, their eyes filled with shame. But Hoover remained steadfast in his philosophy. When members of Congress proposed direct relief programs for the unemployed, he vetoed them. On February 3, 1931, he declared, "Direct federal aid would undermine the moral standing of the recipients." He believed that relief should be provided by local charities and state governments. But charities were exhausted, and states lacked sufficient resources. Cities like New York had to cut budgets for education and public services. Thousands of schools closed. And then, in an effort to balance the federal budget, Hoover made another terrible economic mistake. In June 1930, he signed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, raising import tariffs to the highest level in American history, an average of 59% in order to protect domestic producers. More than 1,000 economists signed a petition urging him to veto the bill, but he did not listen. As a result, other countries retaliated by raising tariffs on American goods. International trade collapsed by 66% from 1929 to 1934. The crisis, originating in the United States, spread throughout the world. By 1931, the situation had become catastrophic. That September, Britain abandoned the gold standard, shaking the global financial system. In December 1931, the Bank of the United States, a large New York bank with 400,000 depositors, collapsed, the largest bank failure in American history at the time. This collapse was not just a statistic. I want you to imagine an immigrant family in the Bronx who had saved every penny for 15 years, depositing all $5,000, a considerable fortune, in that bank. One morning they were rich, the next they were poor. No insurance, no compensation, only despair. Pressure on Hoover mounted. In January 1932, he finally agreed to establish the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, RFC, A government agency granted $2 billion to lend to banks, railroads, and large businesses at low interest rates. This was a significant shift. He had accepted government intervention, but it was too late and too limited. The RFC only rescued large corporations, doing nothing for ordinary people. Unemployed people sarcastically called it the bailout program for the rich. Meanwhile, across America, the image of suffering became increasingly clear. Slums sprang up near major cities where homeless people lived in shacks made of scrap wood and corrugated iron. People called these areas Hooverville, named after the president in a sarcastic way. The largest Hooverville in Seattle had 1,200 residents. In Central Park, New York, hundreds of people pitched makeshift tents. Old cars pulled by horses because of a lack of money for gasoline were called Hoover wagons. Rabbits hunted for food were called Hoover hogs. Old newspapers used as blankets were called Hoover blankets. The name Hoover became a symbol of failure. But the decisive blow to Hoover's credibility came in the summer of 1932. More than 20,000 World War I veterans and their families, a total of about 43,000, flocked to Washington, D.C., setting up camp near the Capitol building. They were called the Bonus Army. The story began in 1924 when Congress had promised veterans a bonus payment, but wouldn't pay it until 1945. Amidst the crisis, these veterans, many unemployed and starving, demanded early payment. Walter Waters, a 34-year-old veteran from Oregon, led the movement. They pitched their tents at Anacostia Flats, a swampy area on the banks of the Potomac River. This wasn't a riot. They were organized, had sanitation, and even a mobile library. They simply wanted to be paid what had been promised to them, those who had shed blood for their country. On June 15, 1932, the House of Representatives passed a bill allowing early payment, but 2 days later, the Senate rejected it by a vote of 62 to 18. When the news broke, the veterans at the camp silently sang the national anthem, America the Beautiful, with tears in their eyes, and slowly dispersed. Many went home, but thousands remained with nowhere else to go. Hoover viewed their presence as a threat. He believed that among them were communist agitators, an unfounded fear. On July 28, 1932, Washington police attempted to evict a group of veterans from an abandoned building on Pennsylvania Avenue. A conflict erupted, and 2 veterans were shot dead. Hoover ordered federal troops to intervene, and this is the moment that defines Hoover's tragedy. At 4 p.m. that day, General Douglas MacArthur, then 52 years old, Chief of Staff of the United States Army, led his troops into Washington. Under his command were Major Dwight D. Eisenhower, the future president, and Major George S. Patton. They brought tanks, cavalry, and infantry with bayonets at the barrel of their rifles. Patton led the cavalry assault. The infantry used tear gas. Tents were burned. Men, women, and children, Americans who had served their country, fled through the smoke and flames. A 12-week-old boy named Bernard Myers died from inhaling tear gas. An 8-year-old boy was fatally wounded by a bayonet. More than 1,000 people were injured. The entire camp was burned to the ground. The image of veterans fleeing the fire and smoke, with the American flag still flying against the black sky, appeared on the front page of every newspaper. It became an iconic image of Hoover's failure. Hoover ordered MacArthur to stop at the city's border, not to cross the Anacostia River to attack the main camp. But MacArthur, with his inflated ego and contempt for rebels, directly disobeyed the order. Eisenhower later recalled that he tried to dissuade MacArthur twice, but the general ignored him. MacArthur advanced across the bridge and burned down the entire Anacostia Flats. Thousands of veterans and their families fled in the darkness of night. The following morning, MacArthur held a press conference and declared the operation a resounding success, necessary to stop the communist rebellion. Hoover, instead of criticizing MacArthur for disobeying orders, publicly endorsed the action. On July 29th, Hoover stated, "A challenge to the authority of the United States government has been met." This was a grave political mistake. Americans did not see the communist rebels. They saw unemployed fathers, veterans who had fought for their country, attacked by their own army. The Bonus Army incident marked the end of Hoover's political career. A poll in August 1932 showed that only 15% of Americans approved of his handling of the situation. Will Rogers, a famous comedian, remarked sarcastically, "Hoover is the only person in history to put 2 chickens in each pot, both bones." But there's a little-known truth. Hoover wasn't a cruel or heartless man. In the final months of his term, he often stayed up late, worried about the hungry and thirsty. His close advisor, Theodore Joslin, recalled that in October 1932, he saw Hoover sitting alone in the Oval Office at midnight, his face buried in his hands, his shoulders trembling with tears. Hoover whispered, "I can't do any more." It was the tragedy of a man imprisoned by his own philosophy, unable to adapt to the new reality the world was facing. In November 1932, as America entered the presidential election, the country was plunged into despair. Industrial output had fallen 46% from 1929. Farmers' incomes had plummeted 60%. More than 13 million people, 25% of the workforce, were unemployed. Over 5,000 banks had gone bankrupt, wiping out $9 billion in deposits. Children were starving in the streets. Families were falling apart as men left their homes, unable to support their families, wandering in search of work on freight trains. Hoover tried to campaign for a second term, but everywhere he went, he was booed and pelted with rotten eggs. In Detroit, people took to the streets with signs that read, "Down with Hoover." In Los Angeles, he was blocked by a crowd of over 10,000 people shouting, "We want bread." Secret Service agents had to shield him from the objects thrown at him. Meanwhile, his rival, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was promising a New Deal to the American people. But who was this man? And was he any different from Hoover? Or was he just another politician with empty promises? On November 8, 1932, the election results provided a clear answer. Roosevelt won 472 electoral votes compared to Hoover's just 59-1. Of the most overwhelming victories in history. Roosevelt won in 42 of the 48 states. The popular vote was 57.4% for Roosevelt versus 39.7% for Hoover. The American people had made their judgment. But between the November 1932 election and the March 1933 inauguration, 4 long months, America remained under Hoover's leadership. And during those 4 months, disaster worsened. In February 1933, Michigan shut down its entire banking system for 8 days to prevent bank runs. Other states quickly followed suit. By March 4, 1933, Roosevelt's inauguration day, 32 states had closed or restricted banking operations. The American financial system was on the verge of complete collapse. Hoover tried to persuade Roosevelt to cooperate during this transitional period. He wrote letters and invited Roosevelt to the White House several times, urging him to publicly endorse Hoover's policies to restore confidence. But Roosevelt politely declined. He knew that Hoover's policies had failed, and he did not want to associate his name with that failure. Roosevelt told his advisor, "This country needs and will demand bold, decisive action." But he kept his plans secret, waiting for the moment of his accession to power. On the morning of March 4, 1933, the Washington sky was gloomy and cold. Herbert Hoover, his face pale and weary, sat in the car with Franklin Roosevelt on their way to the inauguration. The two men barely spoke. Hoover, a 58-year-old battered by defeat, gazed out the window with a blank expression. Roosevelt, 51, in a wheelchair but with a radiant smile, waved to the crowd with unwavering confidence. It was a moment symbolizing the transition between two worlds, The old world, with its belief in free markets and individual responsibility, had collapsed, giving way to a new world where the government would play an active role in protecting and supporting its people. But the biggest question remains. Does this man, a wealthy aristocrat who has never known poverty or unemployment, truly understand the suffering of millions of Americans? And does he have the courage to break with traditions and old rules to save the country? To answer these questions, we need to go back in time and learn about Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a story of privilege and suffering, of glory and tragedy, of a man who faced the most cruel fate and from it forged the strength to change history. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was born on January 30th, 1882, in Hyde Park, New York, a large estate on the banks of the Hudson River. The Roosevelt family belonged to the American upper class from the 17th century. His father, James Roosevelt, was a wealthy businessman, 54 years old when Franklin was born. His mother, Sarah Delano Roosevelt, was only 28 at the time, 26 years younger than her husband. Sarah was a strong-willed, decisive woman, and she dedicated her entire life to protecting and controlling her only son. Franklin grew up in a world most Americans never knew. He was homeschooled by private tutors until he was 14. He learned French and German fluently. Every summer, his family traveled to Europe on the most luxurious ships. He played golf, rode horses, and sailed. When asked about his childhood, Roosevelt later recalled, "I never knew worry about money or the future." It was a world of complete privilege. In 1896, at the age of 14, Franklin was sent to Groton School in Massachusetts, a prestigious boarding school for the children of the aristocracy. There, for the first time in his life, the boy, raised in luxury, faced a harsh reality. He didn't stand out. His classmates had been there for a long time, already forming their own groups. Franklin, a latecomer and not as athletically inclined as the others, felt isolated. Headmaster Endicott Peabody, a strict minister, taught the students that privilege comes with responsibility. He emphasized that those born into wealth had an obligation to serve society. This lesson took root in young Franklin's mind. In 1900, at the age of 18, Roosevelt entered Harvard University. There he began to find himself. He became editor of the Harvard Crimson, a student newspaper. In this role, he wrote editorials advocating social reform and criticizing injustice. But the most important event during this time was not at Harvard, but at a tea party in New York in 1902. Here, Franklin reunited with Anna Eleanor Roosevelt, the granddaughter of President Theodore Roosevelt and a distant cousin of Franklin's. Eleanor, then 18, was tall and thin, not considered beautiful by the standards of the time, but she possessed something that captivated Franklin, a deep concern for the poor and the oppressed. Eleanor volunteered in the slums of Lower East Side Manhattan, teaching immigrant children. She took Franklin to these places, and for the first time in his life, the 20-year-old from Hyde Park saw poverty firsthand, malnourished children, families crammed into dark rooms, the smell of disease and despair. Franklin proposed to Eleanor in November 1903. Sarah Roosevelt, Franklin's mother, was horrified. She felt Eleanor wasn't good enough for her son and tried to break up the relationship by taking Franklin on a 3-month trip around the world. But Franklin was steadfast. They married on March 17, 1905, with President Theodore Roosevelt himself, Eleanor's uncle and Franklin's idol, walking the bride down the aisle. During the wedding, more guests focused on the president than on the newlyweds, which hurt Franklin somewhat, but also encouraged him to make a name for himself. After graduating from Harvard in 1903, Roosevelt studied law at Columbia University. He passed the bar exam in 1907 and worked for a Wall Street law firm. But the job was boring for him. One day in 1907, during lunch with colleagues, 25-year-old Roosevelt declared his plan. "I'm going into politics. First, I'm going to be a New York State legislator, then an assistant secretary of the Navy, then governor of New York, and finally, president. His colleagues laughed, but it wasn't a joke. Roosevelt had planned his life, and surprisingly, almost every step unfolded exactly as planned. In 1910, at the age of 28, Roosevelt was nominated by the Democratic Party to run for the New York State Senate from a Republican-dominated district. No one believed he could win. But Roosevelt rented a red car, a luxury at the time, and traveled through small towns, shaking hands with citizens and listening to their concerns. He spoke of reform and of fighting the corruption of political tycoons. And he won, a surprising victory that shook New York's political world. In Albany, the capital of New York State, Roosevelt quickly established a reputation as a courageous reformer. He led the fight against Tammany Hall, a corrupt Democratic political organization in New York City. He was 1.88 meters tall, young, handsome, with white teeth and a confident smile. Reporters loved him. But behind that charming exterior, Roosevelt at this time was still a narrow-minded man, not yet truly understanding the suffering of the working class. In 1913, a great opportunity arose. Newly elected President Woodrow Wilson appointed Roosevelt, then 31, as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, exactly as he had predicted 6 years earlier. This was a powerful position, overseeing over 65,000 personnel and a vast budget. Roosevelt worked with extraordinary energy. When World War I broke out in 1914, he pushed for the expansion of the U.S. Navy. He frequently clashed with Secretary Josephus Daniels, his direct superior, but more cautious. Roosevelt wanted action. He wanted war. He wanted glory. In 1918, Roosevelt visited the European battlefields. He saw decaying corpses in the trenches, heard the cries of wounded soldiers, and smelled poison gas and gunpowder. This experience matured him, but it wasn't enough to completely change his worldview. Upon his return, he remained an ambitious politician, his eyes fixed on the White House. In 1920, the Democratic Party nominated Roosevelt, then 38, as their vice presidential candidate alongside James Cox. Roosevelt campaigned enthusiastically across the country, delivering hundreds of speeches. But 1920 was not a Democratic year. Americans were weary of war and longed for a return to normalcy, as promised by the Republican candidate Warren Harding. Cox and Roosevelt suffered a crushing defeat, winning only 34% of the popular vote. For the first time in his life, Roosevelt tasted defeat. But he was still young and ambitious. He returned to law and business, making a lot of money, waiting for his next opportunity. He planned to run for governor of New York in 1924 or 1928, and then for president. Everything was going according to plan. Until August 1921, when fate dealt a devastating blow that would forever change Franklin Roosevelt's life. On August 10, 1921, Franklin Roosevelt, 39, was on summer vacation with his family at their summer home on Campobello Island in New Brunswick, Canada. This was Roosevelt's favorite place, where he could sail, swim, and enjoy nature. That day, after sailing and jogging, he felt unusually tired. He thought it was just a common cold, but as he went to bed, he felt a strange chill, despite it being summer. On the morning of August 11th, when Roosevelt tried to stand up, his left leg wouldn't obey. He thought perhaps he'd slept too long and his leg was numb. But by the afternoon, both legs were paralyzed. On August 12th, the paralysis spread to his lower back and arms. He couldn't move, couldn't even use the toilet. Intense, burning pain spread throughout his body. Eleanor and the children had to attend to his every need. A man who had once been strong and confident was now completely helpless, like a child. The local doctors were completely baffled. They thought it might be a blood clot or some other strange illness. It wasn't until August 25th, when Dr. Robert Lovett from Boston arrived, that the diagnosis was made: poliomyelitis. It's a viral disease that attacks the nervous system, causing permanent paralysis. There's no cure. Lovett stated bluntly, "He'll never walk again." This news was like a death sentence for Roosevelt's political career. In 1921, people with disabilities were seen by society as weak and incapable of leadership. Most people thought Roosevelt's political life was over at age 39. But Eleanor didn't think so. And more importantly, Roosevelt himself didn't think so either. The first few months were hell. Roosevelt was bedridden, unable to do anything on his own. Louis Howe, a longtime political consultant and close friend of Roosevelt's, a small, unattractive but utterly devoted man, moved in with the Roosevelt family to help. Louis believed Roosevelt could still become president, and he was determined to keep Roosevelt's name in the public eye. But Sarah Roosevelt Franklin's mother had other plans. She wanted her son to return to Hyde Park, retire, and live a peaceful, cared-for, disabled aristocrat. She believed that continuing in politics would only bring more disappointment and suffering. A silent but fierce battle ensued between Sarah and Eleanor. Eleanor, who had always been timid and let her husband and mother-in-law decide everything, for the first time in her life stood up against Sarah. Eleanor believed Franklin needed a goal, hope, a reason to fight. And she won. Roosevelt began extremely painful physical therapy. Each day, therapists stretched and bent his atrophied muscles. The pain was so intense that he had to clench his teeth to keep from crying out. But he never complained. Instead, he always smiled, always remained optimistic. His son, James Roosevelt, later recalled, "I never once saw my father feel sorry for himself." But behind that smile, Roosevelt endured long, dark nights. His eldest daughter, Anna Roosevelt, recalled hearing soft sobs coming from her father's room at night. Once she asked Eleanor, "Mother, will Father be all right?" Eleanor replied with teary eyes, "I don't know, darling. I can only hope." Gradually, Roosevelt learned to adapt. He practiced moving around in a wheelchair. He practiced standing using heavy 7-kilogram steel leg braces, balancing by locking his knees and spine. With the support of crutches and a helper, he could walk a few steps, actually swaying forward on his arms. Each step was a struggle. He was drenched in sweat. But he persevered, practicing for hours every day. More importantly, Roosevelt learned a valuable lesson from his battle with illness: empathy. Before his paralysis, he was a confident, sometimes arrogant aristocrat who didn't truly understand the suffering of others. But now, dependent on others for the most basic necessities, enduring pain and helplessness, he began to understand the feelings of the vulnerable, the powerless, those in need of help. Frances Perkins, later Secretary of Labor in the Roosevelt administration, the first woman to hold a cabinet position in the U.S., made the insightful observation, "Franklin Roosevelt before 1921 and after 1921 were two different people. Before his illness, he was an ambitious but superficial politician. After his illness, he became a leader with a compassionate heart." In 1924, Roosevelt discovered Warm Springs, Georgia, a resort with a natural, warm mineral pool. Swimming in the warm water, he felt his muscles relax and his pain lessen. For the first time in 3 years, he felt free, albeit only in the water. He loved the place so much that he spent $200,000, almost 2/3 of his fortune, to buy the resort and turn it into a treatment center for polio patients. There, he met hundreds of other patients, children, adults, from all walks of life. He swam with them, laughed with them, encouraged them, and he learned from them, learned about resilience, about hope in the midst of despair. Meanwhile, Eleanor had transformed. She was no longer the timid wife living in her mother-in-law's shadow. She became her husband's legs. She traveled throughout New York, attending political meetings, reading reports for Franklin, and becoming a prominent social activist. She fought for women's rights, for workers' rights, and for black people. The relationship between Franklin and Eleanor had changed. no longer a traditional one, but a deep political partnership. In 1924, at the Democratic National Convention in New York, Roosevelt made his first public appearance since falling ill. He was asked to nominate Al Smith, the governor of New York, for president. This was a tremendous challenge. Roosevelt had to walk, or rather, hobble on crutches from backstage to the podium before thousands of people. His son James assisted him by walking beside him, letting him lean on his arm. Sweat poured down Roosevelt's face. Each step was a battle against the weight of his steel leg braces and the fear of falling in front of the crowd. But when Roosevelt finally reached the podium, he unleashed a radiant smile, a smile that became his iconic one. His voice boomed, full of confidence. "I nominate one happy warrior." The speech lasted 30 minutes, and each sentence was met with applause. When it ended, the entire hall rose to its feet, applauding for 73 minutes, a record. Roosevelt had proven that a disabled person could still be a powerful leader. But he wasn't ready to return to politics yet. He needed more time to train, to strengthen his health. He refused all offers to run for office. Louis Howe and Eleanor continued to keep Roosevelt's name in the public eye through articles and speeches on his behalf. They waited for the perfect moment. In 1928, the time had come. Al Smith had won the Democratic presidential nomination and needed a strong candidate to run for governor of New York to help him win his home state. Everyone in the party pointed to Roosevelt. But Roosevelt hesitated. He thought 1928 would be the Republican year. The economy was booming, and Americans wouldn't want change. He wanted to wait until 1932. But Smith and the party leaders exerted immense pressure. They called Roosevelt dozens of times. Finally, on the evening of October 2, 1928, Roosevelt agreed. This decision would change history. As predicted, Al Smith lost to Herbert Hoover in the presidential election. But Roosevelt, contrary to all expectations, won the New York gubernatorial race by a very narrow margin, only 25,564 votes out of more than 4.2 million casts. On January 1, 1929, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 46, was sworn in as governor of New York State, America's most populous and wealthiest state. He stood on the platform supported by braces and crutches, but his voice rang out with authority and determination. Just 9 months later, the stock market crashed, and while Hoover struggled in Washington, Roosevelt began conducting daring experiments in New York. Roosevelt established the Temporary Emergency Relief Administration, TERA, in August 1931, the first government agency in the United States to provide direct relief to the unemployed. He appointed Harry Hopkins, a passionate 41-year-old social worker, to run the program. Hopkins distributed over $1 billion in relief over 2 years, helping millions of people. When an advisor worried that some might take advantage of the program, Hopkins famously replied, "I would rather give to 100 people who don't really need it than let one person who really needs it starve." Roosevelt also established public employment programs, helping the unemployed work in building parks, roads, and schools. He believed that giving people good jobs was better than just giving them money. "No one wants to live off charity," he said. "People want to work. They want to feel useful." This philosophy would later shape the New Deal. While serving as governor, Roosevelt also subtly cultivated his image in preparation for the presidential race. He mastered the art of concealing his disability. Photographers were politely asked not to photograph him in a wheelchair or while being assisted. When appearing in public, he always walked. In reality, he would lean on an aide's arm while holding crutches in his other hand, creating the illusion that he was walking normally. Most Americans were unaware that their governor was completely unable to walk. By 1932, as the economic crisis worsened, Roosevelt's name resonated throughout the country as a beacon of hope. He was the governor of the wealthiest state, a man who had actually done something to help the people, while Hoover had only paid lip service. His loyal friend, Lewis Howe, orchestrated a skillful campaign, sending thousands of letters to Democratic delegates across the country. Eleanor traveled extensively, speaking to women's groups and social organizations, spreading Franklin's message. At the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in June 1932, Roosevelt won the nomination after 4 dramatic rounds of voting. And then he did something unprecedented. Instead of waiting for the formal ceremony a few weeks later, he immediately flew from Albany to Chicago to accept the nomination, the first flight by a presidential candidate to a party convention. The 9-hour flight was turbulent, causing many in his entourage to vomit, but Roosevelt still smiled and went through his speech. Upon arriving in Chicago at 4:30 p.m. on July 2nd, before a frenzied crowd of over 30,000 people, Roosevelt stood up, supported by his braces and crutches, and declared, "I pledge to you, I pledge to myself, a New Deal for the American people." The phrase New Deal, written into the speech by his advisor Samuel Rosenman, immediately became a symbol of a new era. During his campaign, Roosevelt traveled across America by train, speaking in hundreds of cities. He promised bold, decisive action, but he was also careful not to give too many specific details, knowing that he would have to experiment, adjust, and adapt. As he later admitted to an advisor, "I will try one method. If it fails, I will admit it frankly and try another. But above all, let's try something." Roosevelt's victory in November 1932 was overwhelming. But between Election Day and Inauguration Day, 4 months long according to the Constitution at the time, America had sunk deeper into crisis. The banking system was on the verge of complete collapse. Despair was widespread. Many began to doubt, was Roosevelt truly different from Hoover? Could a disabled man possess the strength to save the country? The answer would come on a chilly March morning in 1933, when Roosevelt stood on the oath of office, gazing out at the sea of people before the Capitol building, and declared words that would be etched in history. "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." And from that moment, the most frenzied, dramatic first 100 days in American presidential history began. On March 4th, 1933, Washington, D.C. was shrouded in gloom. It was cold, windy, and over 100,000 people had gathered outside the Capitol building, not to celebrate, but to find a last glimmer of hope. Many of them had walked miles, unable to afford train tickets. They had come to see if this new man, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, could save them from their nightmare. At 1 p.m., Roosevelt appeared on the platform. He stood, supported by steel leg braces hidden under his trousers, one hand holding the podium, the other a manuscript. The wind ruffled his gray hair. His face was serious but resolute. And then he began to speak, his voice booming through the loudspeakers to millions of Americans listening across the country. "First of all, let me reaffirm my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Anonymous, irrational, unfounded fear that paralyzes the efforts necessary to turn retreat into advance." This statement, written by advisor Lewis Howe and edited by Roosevelt, immediately resonated with millions. It wasn't an empty promise. It was a frank acknowledgement of the fears people were feeling and a call to overcome them. Roosevelt continued in a harsher tone. "The unscrupulous moneylenders have fled from their thrones in the temple of our civilization. Now we can restore that temple with age-old truths." He was referring to the bankers, the Wall Street financiers, those whom many Americans blamed for the crisis. And he promised action. "This nation is calling for action, and action now." The speech lasted 20 minutes. When it ended, the crowd applauded loudly, but the question remained: what concrete action would be taken? The answer came surprisingly quickly. That very evening, Roosevelt signed his first executive order, convening Congress for a special session on March 9th and, more importantly, closing all banks nationwide for 4 days, a bank holiday. This was an unprecedentedly bold move. The entire American financial system, the world's largest banking system, froze completely. William Wooden, the newly appointed Treasury Secretary, a 64-year-old musician and businessman, worked tirelessly for 3 days with his team to draft the Emergency Banking Act. They worked 18 to 20 hours a day, drank coffee constantly, and slept on the sofa in the office. By March 9th, the bill was ready. When Congress convened at noon that day, the bill had not yet been formally printed. They only had a handwritten draft. But Roosevelt demanded that Congress pass it immediately. The House debated for exactly 38 minutes, then voted, 73 in favor, 7 against. The Senate passed it that evening with a 73-7 vote. The entire process, from the bill's introduction to its signing into law, took less than 8 hours, an unprecedented record in American legislative history. The act allows the government to inspect all banks. Only those banks that are adequately capitalized and deemed safe will be allowed to reopen. Weak banks will be restructured or permanently closed. More importantly, the government will support healthy banks by lending money from the Treasury. This is the first time the federal government has directly intervened in the banking system on such a scale. But passing legislation is one thing, convincing people to believe it is another. On Sunday evening, March 12th, Roosevelt did something revolutionary. He addressed the American people live on radio in what became known as the first fireside chat. Approximately 60 million people, nearly half the American population, sat around the radio to listen. Roosevelt's voice was warm and intimate, as if he were speaking to a friend. I want to speak to the American people about the bank. I want to tell you exactly what happened this past week and why it happened, and what will happen next. He explained in simple, easy-to-understand language, no complicated technical jargon, how the banking system worked and why it collapsed. And then he said the most important thing. I can assure you that keeping your money in a bank that is reopened is safer than keeping it under your mattress. On Monday morning, March 13th, when the banks reopened, a miracle happened. Instead of rushing to withdraw money, people lined up to deposit money into the banks. In the first week, more than $1 billion was deposited into banks, more than had been withdrawn in the previous months. The stock market surged 15% in a single day, the largest increase in history at the time. The banking crisis, the greatest threat to the economy, was resolved in just 1 week. This was his first victory, but Roosevelt didn't stop there. He launched a relentless legislative assault that history calls the first 100 days. From March 9th to June 16, 1933, Congress passed 15 major laws, a legislative pace unprecedented then and never again. On March 31st, Roosevelt established the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC. This program recruited unemployed young men aged 18 to 25 to work in forest conservation, park construction, and erosion control. They were paid $30 a month, of which $25 had to be sent home to their families. They lived in camps, were provided with food, clothing, shelter, and skills training. Within 3 months, 250,000 young men had been recruited. By 1942, when the program ended, more than 3 million young men had joined the CCC, planted 3 billion trees, and built thousands of miles of trails and bridges in national parks. On May 12th, Roosevelt signed the Agricultural Adjustment Act, AAA. The problem for American farmers was overproduction. They produced too much, prices plummeted, and they couldn't pay their debts. Roosevelt's solution was to pay farmers to reduce production. It sounds paradoxical, paying to not produce while millions were starving, but the goal was to raise agricultural prices to a sustainable level, giving farmers a stable income. Henry Wallace, the 44-year-old Secretary of Agriculture and an agricultural scientist, oversaw the program. In the first year, farmers' incomes increased by 50%. On May 18th, the most groundbreaking law was passed, the Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA. This was a massive project to develop the entire Tennessee River Valley, a 40,000 square mile area spanning 7 states, the poorest region in America. The TVA built hydroelectric dams, providing cheap electricity, controlling floods, improving river transport, and producing fertilizer. It was an experiment in socialism, the federal government directly providing electricity, competing with private companies. Conservatives vehemently opposed it, calling it communism, but Roosevelt defended it. Is that socialism? I don't care what it's called. I only care about helping the people. On June 16th, the National Industrial Recovery Act, NIRA, was passed. This act has 2 main parts. The first part created the National Recovery Administration, NRA, allowing industries to set their own fair rules regarding prices, wages, and working hours. The goal was to prevent predatory competition, where companies cut wages and prices to compete, leading to a downward spiral. Hugh Johnson, a hot-tempered and outspoken 51-year-old retired general, was appointed to head the NRA. He organized massive parades, with millions carrying banners bearing the NRA's Blue Eagle symbol, urging people to buy only from companies that comply with NRA rules. The second part of NIRA created the Public Works Administration, PWA, headed by Harold Ickes, a 59-year-old Secretary of the Interior, so cautious that he was nicknamed Honest Harold. The PWA was allocated $3.3 billion to build major public works, dams, bridges, highways, schools, and hospitals. In 6 years, the PWA built more than 34,000 projects, including the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco and the Triborough Bridge in New York. But perhaps the most important law in the long run was the Glass-Steagall Act, passed on June 16, 1933. This act created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, insuring bank deposits up to $5,000, equivalent to about $100,000 today. For the first time in history, Americans could deposit money in banks without fear of losing it if the bank failed. The act also separated commercial and investment banks, preventing banks from using customer deposits to speculate on securities, one of the main causes of the 1929 crisis. During those 100 days, Roosevelt worked with frantic intensity. He woke up at 8 a.m., read the newspaper while eating breakfast in bed. From 9 a.m. to 1 p.m., he met constantly with cabinet members, senators, and advisors, often 15 to 20 meetings a day, each lasting 15 to 20 minutes. He possessed an incredible ability to concentrate, listen, ask incisive questions, and make quick decisions. In the afternoons, he worked with the bureaucracy, signed documents, and read reports. In the evenings, he often hosted dinners with guests where he told jokes, relaxed, but also listened to opinions. Eleanor Roosevelt became her husband's eyes and feet. She traveled across America, down into coal mines, into ghettos, to CCC camps, and reported back to Franklin what she saw. On one occasion, she went down into a deep mine in West Virginia, spoke with the miners, and returned with moving stories of their harsh lives. Franklin used this information to shape policy. But not everyone was happy with the New Deal. Wealthy businessmen felt betrayed. They called Roosevelt a traitor to the class, an aristocrat who taxed the rich to help the poor. Conservative newspapers attacked him fiercely. The Chicago Tribune called the New Deal red socialism. Some extremists even plotted a military coup. In 1934, General Smedley Butler revealed that a group of wealthy businessmen had approached him, offering to lead troops to seize the White House and overthrow Roosevelt. Butler refused and exposed the plot, but no one was prosecuted. From the left, progressives argued that Roosevelt hadn't done enough. Huey Long, the Louisiana senator, a dictatorial and charisma-minded figure, proposed the Share Our Wealth program, advocating for the confiscation of the super-rich's assets and redistribution to the general population. He garnered millions of supporters and planned to challenge Roosevelt in the 1936 election. But Long was assassinated in September 1935 by the son-in-law of a political opponent, ending this threat. Father Charles Coughlin, a Catholic priest in Michigan, had a radio program with over 30 million listeners each week. Initially a supporter of Roosevelt, he later turned to fierce criticism, accusing Roosevelt of serving Jewish capitalists. His rhetoric became increasingly anti-Semitic and pro-Nazi. Eventually, the Catholic Church forced him to stop broadcasting in 1942. Roosevelt navigated these extremist forces with exceptional political skill. He knew when to compromise and when to fight. He consistently maintained the support of the majority of ordinary people, those who were genuinely helped by the New Deal. By 1934, there were signs of recovery. GDP had increased by 10.8% compared to 1933. The unemployment rate had fallen from 24.9% to 21.7%, still high, but on the right track. More importantly, confidence had returned. People believed that the government cared about them, that someone was trying to help. But the New Deal remained controversial and challenging. Was it truly economically effective, or simply a waste of money? And could Roosevelt maintain support in the face of increasing challenges from the Supreme Court? That will be the story of the next installment. By 1935, despite some improvements, America was still not out of the Great Depression. Unemployment remained above 20%. Millions of people still lived in poverty, and, more importantly, the Supreme Court, with a majority of conservative justices appointed before Roosevelt took office, had begun to attack the New Deal. On May 27, 1935, in Schechter Poultry Corp. Versus United States, the Supreme Court declared the NRA, National Recovery Administration, unconstitutional by a 9-0 vote. The court argued that Congress had delegated too much legislative power to the executive branch, and that the federal government had no authority to regulate commerce within a single state. This was a devastating blow to the heart of the New Deal. Roosevelt was outraged. In a press conference, he criticized the court for bringing the country back to the age of horses and carriages. But instead of backing down, he decided to counterattack with a bolder wave of reforms, what history calls the Second New Deal. On August 14, 1935, Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act, perhaps the greatest and most lasting achievement of the entire New Deal. This act created a federal retirement insurance system for the elderly, unemployment insurance, and assistance for impoverished children and the disabled. It marked the first time the U.S. federal government committed to protecting its citizens from the economic risks of old age and unemployment. Frances Perkins, the Secretary of Labor and the first woman in the U.S. cabinet, was the principal architect of this program. A passionate 55-year-old social reformer, she had fought for this legislation for years. When Roosevelt signed the law, she stood beside him, tears of joy in her eyes. Roosevelt told her, "Frances, you have accomplished what I thought was impossible." Initially, Social Security covered only about half the workforce, excluding farmers, domestic workers, and many other laborers, largely due to political pressure from Southern congressmen who wanted to exclude black people. But over time, the program has expanded. Today, Social Security is the largest social program of the U.S. government, providing benefits to more than 70 million people. Also in 1935, Roosevelt established the Works Progress Administration, WPA, replacing the old PWA. Harry Hopkins, Roosevelt's closest friend and most trusted advisor, was appointed its head. Hopkins, a thin, sickly, but energetic man, ran the largest employment program in American history. The WPA not only built roads and bridges, but also employed artists, musicians, writers, and actors. The Federal Theater Project provided work for thousands of unemployed actors, performing plays for free for the public. The Federal Writers Project recruited writers to write local histories and interviewed the last surviving enslaved people. The Federal Art Project funded artists to paint murals on public buildings. Conservatives scoffed, calling it a waste of taxpayers' money teaching people to play. But Hopkins retorted, "People have to eat. Artists have to eat too." From 1935 to 1943, the WPA employed more than 8.5 million people, built 651,000 miles of roads, 125,000 public buildings, 75,000 bridges, 8,000 parks, and 800 airports. On July 5, 1935, Roosevelt signed the National Labor Relations Act, also known as the Wagner Act after its proponent, Senator Robert Wagner of New York. This act protected workers' rights to form and join unions and compelled employers to negotiate honestly with unions. The act also created the National Labor Relations Board, NLRB, to resolve labor disputes. It was one of the most powerful pro-labor laws in American history. As a result, union membership skyrocketed. In 1935, there were only 3.7 million unionized workers. By 1941, that number had risen to 10.5 million. Large strikes took place across the country, particularly in the automotive industry. In late 1936, workers at the General Motors plant in Flint, Michigan, staged a sit-down strike. They occupied the factory and refused to leave. The strike lasted 44 days during the harsh winter. The Michigan governor, under pressure from GM, wanted to use the National Guard to evict the workers, but Eleanor Roosevelt called the governor, persuading him not to use violence. Ultimately, GM surrendered, recognizing the United Auto Workers Union. This was a historic victory for the labor movement. But just as the New Deal was achieving its greatest success, Roosevelt made a grave political mistake. After his overwhelming re-election in 1936, with 60.8% of the popular vote winning 46 of 48 states, Roosevelt felt he had a powerful mandate from the people. He decided to address the issue that had long troubled him, the Supreme Court. In February 1937, Roosevelt put forward a shocking proposal, allowing the president to appoint one additional Supreme Court justice for every existing justice over 70 who was not retiring, up to a maximum of 6. At that time, there were 6 justices over 70, so this proposal would effectively allow Roosevelt to appoint 6 new justices, creating a 15-9 majority in favor of the New Deal. This was known as the court-packing plan. The immediate reaction was a storm of criticism. Not only Republicans, but also many Democrats opposed it. They saw it as an attempt to destroy the independence of the judiciary, a violation of the principle of checks and balances. Even a supporter of the New Deal like Senator Burton Wheeler stood up against it, calling the plan going too far. However, something strange happened. Just when the debate was at its most heated, the Supreme Court suddenly changed course. On March 29, 1937, in the case of West Coast Hotel Company versus Parrish, the court upheld a Washington state minimum wage law by a 5-4 vote. Justice Owen Roberts, who had previously voted conservatively, switched to voting liberal. History calls this the switch in time that saved 9. In the following months, the court upheld the Social Security Act, the Wagner Act, and other New Deal laws. Roosevelt's legal victory was complete, but his political victory was not. The court-packing plan was rejected by Congress in July 1937. This was Roosevelt's biggest political defeat, damaging his reputation and weakening the New Deal coalition. Worse still, in the fall of 1937, the economy plunged into recession again. Roosevelt, believing the economic recovery was solid, cut government spending to balance the budget. The result was disastrous. Industrial output fell 32% in 7 months. The unemployment rate rose from 14.3% to 19%. Nearly 4 million people lost their jobs. This became known as the Roosevelt recession. This taught Roosevelt an important lesson in Keynesian economics. During a recession, the government must spend more, not less. In 1938, Roosevelt reverted to large deficit spending. He asked Congress to allocate an additional $3.75 billion to the WPA and PWA. The economy began to recover, but the painful truth is that the New Deal never truly ended the Great Depression. By 1939, the unemployment rate was still 17.2%. What ultimately pulled America out of the crisis wasn't the New Deal, but World War II. When war broke out in Europe in 1939, orders for weapons and military supplies from Britain and France poured into America. Factories operated at full capacity. When America entered the war in December 1941, after Pearl Harbor, 12 million men were drafted into the military, and millions of women went to work in factories. The unemployment rate fell below 2% by 1943. So, if New Deal doesn't end the crisis, will it fail? The answer depends on how you measure success. From a purely economic standpoint, the New Deal had both successes and failures. GDP grew at an average rate of 8.9% per year from 1933 to 1937, an impressive growth rate. But the economy did not return to pre-1929 crisis levels until 1941. Some economists argue that the New Deal prolonged the crisis by intervening too much in the free market. Others argue that the New Deal saved capitalism from complete collapse. But the true legacy of the New Deal lies not in economic statistics. It lies in the fundamental changes it brought about in the relationship between government and citizens. Before the New Deal, the U.S. federal government was small and had little role in people's daily lives. Most Americans had never seen a federal official. After the New Deal, the government became an active force in people's lives, providing Social Security, protecting workers' rights, regulating banks and the stock market, ensuring deposits, and building infrastructure. The New Deal created what is known as the American welfare state. Programs like Social Security, Medicare, added in 1965, and unemployment insurance, all originated from the New Deal. Tens of millions of Americans today depend on these programs. The New Deal also changed America's political alliances. Roosevelt created the New Deal Coalition, an alliance of industrialists, black people, immigrants, Jews, intellectuals, and the South. This alliance dominated American politics for nearly 50 years until Ronald Reagan broke it up in the 1980s. More importantly, the New Deal restored faith in democracy. In the early 1930s, many doubted whether democracy could solve the economic crisis. They looked to Europe, where dictatorships, Hitler in Germany, Mussolini in Italy, Stalin and the Soviet Union, seemed to be making things work. There were fascist and communist movements right here in America. But Roosevelt proved that a democratic government could act boldly, quickly, and effectively without sacrificing liberty. As he said in his second inaugural address in 1937, "Our test of progress is not whether we give more to those who have much, but whether we give enough to those who have too little." Franklin Roosevelt was elected president 4 times, a record that will never be broken because the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution, passed in 1951, limits the president to 2 terms. He led America not only through the Great Depression, but also through World War II. On April 12, 1945, just weeks before Germany surrendered, Roosevelt died of a brain hemorrhage at the age of 63 in Warm Springs, Georgia, where he had found solace years earlier. When news of his death broke, the nation was shocked. Millions wept as if they had lost a family member. A black man in Washington, D.C., told reporters, "I feel as though I knew him. I feel worse than when my father died because I knew my father would die, but I didn't think Roosevelt could die." A poor woman in Appalachia said, "He was the only person who ever made me believe that the government cared about people like me." So what have we learned from the story of the Great Depression and Franklin D. Roosevelt? First, the crisis didn't happen overnight. The Great Depression was the result of years of accumulated inequality, uncontrolled speculation, and blind faith in the free market. Warning signs had been there for a long time, but few paid attention. The lesson today? We must pay attention to growing inequality, to asset bubbles, to systemic risks in the economy. Secondly, true leadership requires empathy and courage. Herbert Hoover was intelligent and humane, but he was trapped by old ways of thinking and unable to adapt. Roosevelt, on the other hand, had experienced personal suffering, his battle with polio, and from that learned empathy for those who suffer. He had the courage to experiment, to admit mistakes, and to try again. Trying something is better than doing nothing. Third, belief and hope are just as important as objective truth. When Roosevelt said, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself," he wasn't just offering a catchy slogan. He was addressing the deepest psychological problem of the crisis. When people are afraid, they stop spending, stop investing, stop believing. This self-reinforcing cycle can only be broken by restoring trust. That's why Roosevelt's fireside chats were so powerful. They directly addressed people's fears and offered hope. Fourth, the government has a crucial role to play in protecting citizens from economic shocks. The free market is a powerful tool for wealth creation, but it doesn't automatically protect the vulnerable. Social Security, deposit insurance, unemployment insurance, workers' rights, all of these are legacies of the New Deal and have saved millions of Americans from poverty and despair. Fifth, democracy can resolve crises without sacrificing freedom. In the 1930s, many believed that only dictatorships could act quickly and decisively enough to resolve economic crises. But Roosevelt proved them wrong. A democratic government with checks and balances and with freedom of speech and the press could still implement fundamental and bold reforms. Ultimately, personal tragedy can forge great leaders. Roosevelt, before 1921, was an ambitious but superficial politician. Polio deprived him of his mobility, but it gave him something far more valuable: profound empathy for the suffering, patience born of pain, and determination honed through trials. As Francis Perkins said, "The experience of polio gave him an understanding of human suffering and pain that he could never have otherwise acquired." Looking back nearly a century later, we can see that the Great Depression was more than just an economic catastrophe. It was a turning point in history, a moment when America and the world had to choose between continuing on a failed old path or bravely attempting a new one. Thanks to the leadership of Franklin Roosevelt and the courage of the American people, they chose that new path. And although that path was fraught with obstacles, mistakes, and failures, it ultimately led to a more just, humane, and resilient society. Dear friends of History PhD, this is the story of the Great Depression and Franklin D. Roosevelt, a story of failure and recovery, of despair and hope, of how a nation and an individual can rise from the ruins to build a better future. History is not a dead past. It is a mirror reflecting the present and a beacon illuminating the future. The lessons from the 1930s about the importance of courageous leadership, empathy, hope, and collective action remain profoundly relevant to us today as we face our own challenges. Thank you for following this 6-part series. If you found it helpful, don't forget to subscribe to the History PhD channel, like and share this video with your friends. Leave a comment to let us know your thoughts or what historical topic you'd like us to explore next. Remember, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Roosevelt's words resonate through time, reminding us that no matter how great the challenge, with courage, unity, and hope, we can overcome it. See you again on our next historical journeys. This is History PhD, where history comes alive. Goodbye, and see you again.